Hi, everybody. Jose Palomino again with another episode of the Revenue Throughput Podcast. And today we're going to talk to somebody who's a true expert in B2B sales, in complex sales organizations, especially those companies that are looking for fast growth. He's Nigel Green. He's the author of the recent bestseller, Revenue Harvest, available on Amazon, by the way. And we're really excited to have Nigel on our podcast to talk about the complex sale, how to organize the new math of selling. Let's get started with Nigel right now. Well, welcome, Nigel, to the Revenue Throughput Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, one thing that's really helpful to our audience, Nigel, and I always like to get it from our guests directly, is a simple question. Who do you serve and what do you do for them? And I'm sure there's many things you do, but what do you primarily focus on?
Yeah, so most of my customers they have a B2B sales team. They are equity backed, typically in the mid market. So they're doing somewhere between 10 million and 50 million a year in annual revenue. And their sales team is complex, meaning that they have a diversification of roles, different types of jobs, different responsibilities. There's a lot of complexity in how they go to market. And I work with the management team and specifically alongside their sales leader to help increase sales, help the company scale smarter so that they can exit the business, so that their equity sponsor who's invested in them can exit in the next 3 to 5 years, typically 3 to 5 years.
So this is really a kind of a high velocity growth sales environment that you help people with.
Correct. And I love that you've got throughput in the name of the podcast, because essentially the essence of my work is a series of inputs and outputs. And I tell a lot of the management teams that I work with that it really is a math equation. There are obvious contextual variables that have to be taken into consideration, nuances in the marketplace, competitive advantages, things like that. But essentially, building a sales team is a series of different equations.
Well, it's interesting because we know certainly sales is a human activity, clearly. I mean, otherwise we would have robots doing it. And that may yet come, who knows? But right now it's still people are still necessary in that equation. But yet that seems to suggest there is a math to it. In other words, there's a certain amount of it sounds like work effort that you need to monitor. So do you ever walk into a management situation where you just say, gee, I just don't see the productivity here, and that's part of your problem to hit your numbers?
Yes and no. So there are sometimes instances where it really is a matter of doing more activity, right? Uh, where we're asking maybe more meetings, more outbound calls, more volume of some activity that we believe is going to create interest in the offering. Oftentimes, what I see is that they are measuring activity and doing tons of activity. But where the math's off is it's not the activity that the customer wants. So, for example, in today's world, and I see this a lot, I get, no joke, 20 to 30 LinkedIn messages a day where it's someone trying to get me, a sales consultant, into their funnel for some type of software or some type of value that they think I'm going to be able to bring to my customer that's going to make my consultancy easier. The challenge is that it doesn't matter how many messages they send out a day, the sentiment is off, meaning that the message is all about them. It's all about the offering. It doesn't take into account, is this relevant to me? So what we have to go in and do is say, if you just look at volume alone, volume in isolation, you're still not going to hit your numbers. You can do 10 times the volume, it won't matter. Actually, what's better to do is make sure that all the things we're measuring, all the activities, all these performance indicators actually map to the way your customer wants to buy. So you've got a sales process, but then you've got a buyer's journey. And oh, by the way, the buyer's journey has fundamentally changed in the last 24 months. And so you have to do the work, CEOs, sales leaders listening, to go back and look at your sales process and say, where are all the stages and steps? Where are all the activities or are they misaligned with the way the customer wants us to communicate with them?
So it's interesting. So the customer is definitely leading the buying process as much as we'd like to think we're driving the sales process. It's kind of what it sounds like.
Yeah, it's a push and pull. So you can drive the sales process all you want with marginal effectiveness, or you can meet the customers where they are and pull them along a journey, adding information, adding relevancy along the way, just mapping the solution to the felt needs and pain of the business. There was a great leader that I worked with that said any motivation you can give a customer to buy is never going to be as strong as the motivation that already exists.
Wow, that's actually you could ponder that for a little while over a cup of coffee and stretch your brain a little bit on that one.
But if you
That's
think about it, a lot of our messages are, if you struggle with blah, 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 no, just say, hey, tell me what's going on
right.
and shut up and listen to, and let them tell you why they might use your offering.
Now, you mentioned, and I'm not asking you to reveal any confidences, but you work with companies that are often equity based, that are looking for an exit. That often sounds like something technology based. At least in my experience, those are the kind of companies that get that kind of aggressive investment. Not always, but I'm leading to a question, which is this. Often, I've found that sales teams that have a very technical product, a product with lots of speeds and feeds and features, still want to tell people all about those speeds and feeds and features. And so, what would you say to somebody who thinks, you got to believe me, I got Nigel, I have the better mousetrap. I just have to have people understand my better mousetrap and they'd want to buy it. How would you respond to that sales leader who thinks it's about really, if I can only communicate how much better my stuff is than the other guy's stuff?
What I would say is, first and foremost, you're right. It's prevalent in the marketplace, this vomiting, if you will, of tech specs. I would ask that sales leader, who buys it? Is it a technical buyer, or is it someone else non-technical that's going to buy the solution? So for example, I work with a company, they're an iPaaS, so an integration platform as a solution. So they connect all these disparate data sets through their tool. It's a very technical product, but oftentimes it's someone non-technical like me, the sales leader or the chief marketing officer, that just needs all the data to talk. So they've got to be able to understand and craft their pitch, not about the spec features, but about what it does to the person, the buyer, what it does for their career, how making this decision makes their life easier, or how it aligns very well with some goal that they've got in their role over the next 6 to 9 months. Because ultimately they're paying for an outcome, not the way it gets there. I forget the gentleman's name that coined this phrase. It's customers don't buy drill bits; they're buying holes. Mm-hmm. They want holes in the wall to hang up the pictures, to redesign a room. That's how you sell drill bits. And it's the same thing in this very technical environment. Doesn't matter about all the stuff that you just mentioned. What's the outcome it provides to the business?
So in that exact example, much stronger to ask somebody, what would it mean to you if you could pull all the information your company's capturing from all sources into one easy to review place, versus talking to them about socket layers and other very technical arcana that the person you're talking to, who actually has the budget, may not care that much about. He says, listen, I just want to log in and see everything. Can you do that for me?
The other thing that I think it's worth pointing out in this particular situation when we're talking about very technical offerings, oftentimes companies that have a piece of technology, they don't lose the deal to a competitor. They lose the deal to apathy. The solution is so technical and so hard to understand that the customer is apathetic, meaning they could go either way. They don't know if they need it or not. So what they end up losing the deal to is a customer choosing to invest time, human capital, and money in a completely separate problem in the business, in another category altogether, because they better understand the problem and how the solution being proposed provides an outcome.
Wow. So that's actually a really interesting point. I think one I'd like to pivot on in this discussion here, Nigel, is the fact that you can often lose either to, certainly you can lose to a competitor if something's in a real structured bid situation. You can certainly lose to the status quo, right? Like they have a way of, you know what, I'll just hire two extra people and we'll get the job done that way. Or, and this is a really interesting thought, it's just such an overwhelming decision, and the way the seller has presented it just makes it feel even more overwhelming. I'll take a pass on it for now. So, when you encounter a company, and I'm really thinking about our listeners here, how would you diagnose which of those things is happening? Like, how would you dig in to for them to say, it's an owner listening to this podcast now saying, yeah, I wonder, do we do that? What are some good questions they should be asking their sales teams to see whether or not they're letting themselves slide into that? You know, they're actually creating apathy instead of interest.
Well, one thing that the question I would ask with is, Miss Customer, how will you know if this solution is working? What are the ways in which the business plans to evaluate the effectiveness of this implementation or this offering altogether? A follow-up question would be, why now? What is it about the business that makes this such a bigger priority than all the other things you could do? Those two questions alone will get the prospect to lean in and tell you more about how they plan to use it, the problem that it plans to solve. They're telling you how to sell it, essentially.
Right, and if the why now question gets a pretty flat answer, like, well, you know, we want to actually we're doing our planning for 2023, then at least you know that, and you know, knowing is power in sales because you can reallocate your time and energy into something else.
But this is the math part that I'm talking about when I go in an audit. So they're planning for 2023, yet I will see this in the pipeline for the second half of 2021. And I say, guys, you're majoring in the minor things. This deal is valid, but it's not valid in the timeline that you need it for this period's pipeline, yet we're counting it. And that's where the sales leader, so again, it's not the seller's fault. The seller did what you asked him to do, had a meeting, met with a qualified buyer, proposed, got a timeline, got a financial commitment, all the things we want him to do. The sales leader had it in the pipeline. That's the math that I have to go in and beat up in my job as an outsider.
Right, because they're basically what they're saying to you there. Well, all we have to do is get them to accelerate the project by 18 months.
And hope's not a very effective strategy for growing a business.
Wow, wow, that's really good. So Nigel, what else do you see when you're doing diagnostic, right? When you're trying to assess, and you're describing teams that have, like, you know, talented, perhaps experienced individuals in these different positions, and if they're talking to you, it's probably because something isn't quite clicking the way they thought it should. I mean, if they were moving and grooving and booming, they might not be talking to you or anybody else. They're just busy making, you know, having great success. So, what are some things you look for to say, where else is the math off?
The very first thing is understanding that compensation plans drive every single thing in a sales organization, how they spend their time, how they communicate with customers, how they position your offering. So I look at the comp plan and then I meet with the executive team to try to get a sense for how well aligned is this comp plan to the business goals of the company. Because at some point it was perfect, but then the comp plan didn't move in parallel with what the business needs. And let me give you an example of that just to further contextualize. When you were quickly scaling, it was all about top line revenue. Don't worry about it. Just get the logos, acquire the customers, and we'll figure it out. And you built a comp plan for that. Well, now as the business is stabilizing, you need to keep them. You can't just keep going and getting new customers, because we know it's far easier to keep a customer you've already acquired than it is to get another one. So what you want to do is for each new logo to be additive, not replacing churn. But there's nothing in the comp plan about retaining the business. All it does is incent new business. So you have a sales team that is churning and burning, and you have nothing in the organization, whether it's a discrete department or some type of qualitative metric in the seller's comp plan that accounts for keeping customers.
But we launch a customer success team. Isn't it their job to keep people happy? Because after all, we have some pretty good hunters, and we need to keep adding logos to the front end.
Sure, maybe that's what you did is you created specialization, but now you've got a customer success team that you just pay a salary. They don't have any incentive to do their job excellently. And oh, by the way, the person that manages your customer success team is also the VP of sales, and her entire comp plan is built on new logos. There's nothing in her comp plan or in her annual review that accounts for the extent to which we keep customers. Huh. It's interesting.
So what's really fascinating about that is oftentimes these comp plans are built by people who maybe long ago in a galaxy far, far away worked on a quota-based environment, but it's been a long time. And I think they lose sight of, and I really appreciate you bringing a focus to it. The comp plan is the truth of what management wants from me if I'm a sales rep. You can tell me anything else. You can say, we want to grow, we wanted this, we want strategic that, or whatever. I'm going to look at my comp plan and say, this is what you really want me to do. So if you're paying this at 5% and this at 1%, that tells me you want these 5% deals more than the 1% deals. Pretty simple math. It's not complicated, actually. And yet, I agree with you. I see where those things are often misaligned. But you tied it to like stage of life in the business, right? So in other words, looking at where you are in your stage of life of business tells you to revisit comp plans. In your experience, how often do people really revisit the comp plan other than from a CFO point of view, we have to cut our sales cost?
Outside of that example, most businesses don't evaluate a comp plan as much as they should. Now, let me give some explanation to that. I also see companies that change it too whimsically. Comp plans need to be adjusted every year, no more frequently. If you change the plan more than once a year, you lose credibility as a management team. If you don't look at it, inspect it every year, well, then you run the risk of falling in the category that you and I just categorized. However, comp plan review is not done just by the management team without input from even frontline sellers. And here's why that's important. If you're the CFO listening, well, why am I going to ask the sales team? Because they're going to just want more money. You, Mr. CFO, have a responsibility to building a plan that lets the sales leader have a competitive advantage when it comes to recruiting top talent. If you don't have a comp plan that is enticing to your industry's best sellers, how are you going to compete with them?
Wow. So the cost of not being able to attract talent, because after all, as we know, your product does not actually sell itself in most cases, as much as people might want to think they do. So the talent aspect is important. Also, I think even just the attitude adjustment, it will affect the fact that you're even asking like what matters to your sellers as far as what would motivate them.
Let me say this: the cost of not having a competitive compensation plan that attracts top talent is far more expensive than any monthly commission run that would hit the P&L.
Wow. So one thing that just looking at, so comp drives everything because it's the clearest declaration of what your intentions are, what matters to you, what you want to move of your various product lines and so on. That's one area where the math is off. The other, of course, is trying to, and you described this issue of trying to lead the buyer in a way they don't want to go. So what's one, and we'll kind of close with this thought, what is one big disconnect that you've seen between a selling process that wants to do ABC steps and a buyer's journey that says, no, I want to do a DEF? What's an example of a disconnect? So somebody listening to this podcast could say, okay, that's what that disconnect looks like.
I'll give you a real one. And this is again, we'll stick with the technical offerings that we have. There's this stage in their process of a proof of concept.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some instances, it means let us show you how it works before you make the financial commitment. I'm seeing a lot of times that the proof of concept is a barrier to getting the deal done, that you have to get access to all this data. You uncover problems that are normal and usual during an implementation phase, but because the customer has no financial commitment, they don't work with you to overcome those challenges, and it sabotages the deal. But had they been financially and emotionally invested through a signed contract, they might respond to your emails on the implementation team, or might be a little bit more keen to give you the information you need so that the proof of concept goes well. So what I'm seeing is like the spirit behind a proof of concept is meant to give before you get, but oftentimes it sabotages deals. And you could have gotten the deal without a proof of concept.
Interesting. That's fascinating. Well, I mean, especially once you're not rolling out of the garage, but you actually are an established firm. You have referenceable wins, the things you can talk about, your successes. You have case studies, those things. In a sense, that's the proof area, which mitigates the risk on the part of the buyer, right? Which is all the proof of concept was intended to do in the first place. But it's fascinating that by adding that step, which probably, who knows, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, was the way you knocked it down. But things change, which I'm taking as the meta theme from you, Nigel, is that things change and you have to adapt.
Things always change. I don't know one industry that didn't have even the most subtle of changes after this black swan event that we had in 2020. So I don't know one single industry that hasn't been fundamentally disintermediated.
Wow. Well, with that, Nigel, first of all, thank you so much for these great insights. Just like I've just taken pages of notes here for myself because it's really great stuff. If somebody listening wanted to know more about you and your work, what's the best way to get a hold of you or to find out more about you and what you do for companies?
So the best way is find me on LinkedIn. That's really simple. You can go to my website, nigelgreen.co. If you have a sales team, it might be worth reading my book, Revenue Harvest. I have assembled 7 timeless principles that will allow a leader to hit their sales target year in and year out.
Well, Revenue Harvest, and the way to get that book would be on
Any,
your.
you want to get anywhere you can get a book, you can find Revenue Harvest.
Okay, love the name too. That's a great name. So Nigel,
Thank you.
thank you so much. You've been a great guest. Really appreciate it, and I'm sure our listeners appreciate it as well.
Thank you, Jose.